And welcome to the Emerging Civil War podcast. I'm Chris Mackowski, and I have two fantastic Western historians. I mean, they're great historians in any regard, but two great Western historians with me today. One of our long time contributors, Lee White, author of "Let Us Die Like Men: The Battle of Franklin." Lee, how you doing tonight?
I'm doing good, Chris. How are you?
We're just delighted to have you with us tonight. It's great to trek you out for an event like this. So thank you very much. And from the Battle of Franklin Trust, their historian Joe Ricci. Joe, how are you tonight?
I'm doing great, Chris, and it's always fun to get to hang out with you guys and with Lee, and it's a good time.
So, well, I'm looking forward to it because tonight, it's the 160th anniversary of the Battle of Franklin, and I thought, hey, what better way to practice history than to just armchair general the whole thing through the lens of hindsight? So I thought I'd get the two smartest Franklin guys that I can grab my hands on, and I'm just going to toss out some questions or some statements, and I'd like the two of you to just sort of react to them, and we'll kind of see where the conversation goes, if that's all right. So, and now I just want to start out with just the whole idea that this campaign was just a bad idea to begin with. So, oh, the sound of disgust from Joe. Well, let me start then first.
Well, what else is there to do? That's how I always kind of justify it as, what else is John Bell Hood supposed to do with the largest mobile Confederate army in existence? Is he supposed to chase William Tecumseh Sherman and annoy him? Because that's really all that he would be able to do, facing almost 2 and 3 to 1 odds on the march to the sea. It's actually better for Hood to turn and go on the offensive north. And I think even in his mind and in the minds of a lot of the soldiers, moving in the opposite direction for the first time in 2 years was almost a kind of a healing experience for the Army of Tennessee. Retreating 126 miles to Atlanta and then all of a sudden putting on the brakes and going in the opposite direction boons the morale of the Army of Tennessee and sends them into the volunteer state ready to fight. And then two, there's the objective, Nashville. It's easy. On paper, it should be really easy. Lee, you and I, we've talked about this, and we've been tagged into so many Facebook conversations, but, Hood's got 33,000 of some of the best soldiers that the Confederate Army either theater could muster, and there's only 10,000 men guarding the city of Nashville. So if he moves quick, he gets there, winters, crosses into Kentucky, then who knows what he does. I always like to throw out Hood thought that he could get into Virginia. If he was left unmolested, he could move out of Tennessee and into Kentucky, out of Kentucky, swing down through Ohio and come out through the mountain range and end up in Virginia.
So what do you think, Lee?
Like Joey said, what's there to do? He's got the only mobile force. He's not pinned down like Lee is. Mm-hmm. And, they've got, if he, one of the many things that's always batted about, and Joey knows this as well, is that they say, well, Hood should have flowed Sherman, as he said. But the thing is, that leads only to one place: surrender, the end. Mm-hmm. And although the odds are, can be questionable in this, Hood sees himself as the only hope the Confederacy has of winning the war. And it may be a Hail Mary pass, but it's either that or just give up. And at that point, why not just, surrender then? There's some, in his mind and many of the soldiers' minds, there's still hope.
So that goes against his directive too, right? Because Davis tells him fight. So he fights around Atlanta, and that, honest to goodness, Jonesboro is a close run thing. He has a couple of close calls in Atlanta, and let's be honest, let's give him a pass on Atlanta, because he inherits a really, really bad situation from Joe Johnston. And then what else is he supposed to do? He could do like Johnston would have and retreated all the way down to Key West and then surrender in Cuba. But I can hear the Joe Johnston fans. They're right out the window right now.
All two of them, is that? But let me play devil's advocate for a second, because you say, like, well, what else is there to do? But like, the election has happened. We know Lincoln's going to see this thing through. Isn't it just a waste of blood and manpower at this point then?
I don't think so. I mean, again, Hood thinks they can win this. I mean, there's these diehards who, even facing surrender in 1865, still think they're somehow going to be able to pull the rabbit out of the hat and win this thing.
And too, I'd add to that, when Hood starts to conceive of the plan to move north, Lincoln hasn't been elected yet. And the election is still, it's still a week or 2 weeks away. And if you can move with speed, you can get out of Georgia and into Alabama. Maybe he throws the fact that, hey, there's an army moving north on the offensive into the mindset of the northern voter. But I was reading because not only do I write occasionally for Emerging Civil War, I do read everything that Emerging Civil War puts out on their blog. It was the question, what's the most important thing to come out of 1864? And everyone unanimously says Lincoln's reelection. And I agree wholeheartedly. I don't think that Lincoln would have not been reelected by November of 1864, or would have not been reelected even by October of 1864. I think that's almost a foregone conclusion after Atlanta falls in September and after Farragut takes Mobile. So Hood's moving north maybe isn't so much to disrupt the election or to dissuade people from voting a certain way. It's almost as if it's a last gasp, a last attempt to try and force the issue of a Confederate army going on the offensive.
I want to thank you, first of all, for leaving Phil Sheridan off your list of tide turners there when you talked about Sherman Farragut. No, because I have a tough time saying nice things about Sheridan. So, we'll just.
So do I.
Look, the empty shelf over there, that's all the Sheridan biographies that I have. It's just all the great books about Phil Sheridan.
Yeah, all great books. So there's no chance then that Hood is going to be able to disrupt the election, even though it's still undecided by the time he launches the campaign.
I don't think so.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I don't think so either.
All right. So this is just a Hail Mary, and we're just going to try to be disruptive in the rear. Is that it?
Yep.
Okay.
Well, Hail Mary pass, then maybe somehow he can, I think it's more, a lot of this is going on the fly too. He's just looking to try to, has the overall idea of the campaign, but when things start changing, some of the objectives start changing. But again, as desperate as it is, he is looking for a way to somehow win this.
Okay. I think I'm going to have T-shirts made up that would have Hood's picture on it with the caption that says, "What else is there to do?" I think that. All right, so let's switch. Go ahead.
I still think the best T-shirt is John Bell Hood on this side, Ben Cheatham here, and the caption is, "I'm not mad, I'm just disappointed." John Bell Hood, November 30th, 1860.
Maybe, with the outline of a breaking heart, like there are two halves.
So let's switch gears here for a second and look at the other sign. And I'm going to say that John Schofield deserves more credit than he typically gets. What do you guys think? Lee, let me have you start with this one since I had Joe start with the last one.
Yes and no is how I would come down.
Okay.
I mean, on one hand, Schofield is served by a really great set of subordinate officers. And of course, that's, going to play a part of it. But I know Joey's got a little more on this than I do. So
So Joe and I actually had a good podcast episode. You can go back into the archives and listen to where we talked about John Schofield and was he a genius or was he a snake? And Joe, you actually had more positive things about Schofield to say than I expected.
I try to find a way to make everybody angry. So if people are no longer upset with John Bell Hood, now they're trying to scapegoat poor John Schofield for things. I have to naturally take on the cloak of Hood apologist and then switch that one out for my Schofield apologist. I think really his reaction throughout the entire campaign, his ability to coordinate his forces with the speed in which he's able to, his reaction to Hood in Columbia and the maneuver to Spring Hill, while delayed and while he has this kind of slow to start reaction on the morning of the 29th, the day that Spring Hill gets underway, or Hood's march to Spring Hill's underway, Schofield reacts with enough clarity to move guns and wagons, to move the heavy things out of the way, and just the force organization for a really desperate situation that he's thrown into. Because how would you like to be the guy? We're sitting here armchair generaling. Let's throw somebody else into this mix. How would you like to be the guy that gets orders from George Thomas and William Tecumseh Sherman? Your job's to get in front of John Bell Hood. You know, that guy that we've been spending the last 3.5 months trying to get out of Atlanta. Well, we're going to send you with 28,000 men, almost 14,000 of which are not your own troops and are not your own subordinates and are from a completely different army. We're going to send you to slow down Hood and grease the wheels for Nashville's defenses to buy time. And add to that, as great of a soldier and as great as an officer as George Henry Thomas is, Thomas is on his back the entire time, telling him how to conduct the campaign, where he needs to go, what he should do next, and what every single one of his moves after the word should be. And yet Schofield in the field does something that he's not necessarily great at, which is tactical command. And I think he performs pretty well. I mean, the proof is in the result, right? He beats Hood in Spring Hill. He beats him again in Franklin. And then he's there in Nashville. And granted, now the 23rd Corps doesn't take a massive part in the fighting at Nashville, but he's still there. And he can rightfully say that he had helped to destroy Hood's army in this campaign. So, yeah, I think he should get more credit than he has been given.
And Lee, I see you nodding along there and a couple of things.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I said, like I said, there's a little of A, a little of A, and a little of B in there. But again, I think it just plays in how the campaign is have for so long been viewed, which is just almost that Hood is committing hari-kari with his army. That there's no Union force or any guys in blue involved in this.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's just solely a Confederate story of like suicide. And, you know, Schofield many times could have botched things up to a degree that would have resulted in a disaster there, but he doesn't. So like Joey said, the proof is in the pudding. So
very good. Now I'm going to say something very controversial here. I think John Bell Hood has a better beard than John Schofield does.
Oh yeah.
Oh yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
All right, good. All right.
That's not even controversial. That's just God's honest truth.
Okay. Although I think Lee White's, for folks who are listening, Lee White has a better beard than either of the two commanders in the campaign. I think you win that one there. So, all right. So, and I would encourage folks to go back and listen to that podcast we did about John Schofield. Sean Chick was in on that as well, and some lots of things, as Lee says, things from column A and things from column B that I hope would help people reconsider Schofield in some different ways. All right. So you guys have mentioned Spring Hill. Hood could have stopped the whole thing at Spring Hill, but he blew it, and I'm going to say it's all his fault. Joe, do you agree?
This sound familiar, Joe?
In a word, no. Wrong.
And Joe loves Spring Hill, so I'm kind of lobbing a softball to him here at this point.
So where do we start? John Bell Hood executes, and I think rightfully in his memory of the event, he said it is the greatest move in his career as a soldier. He's 100% correct in that. He hadn't shown this kind of tactical brilliance on a battlefield before. And he strings together what looks like something like your guy, Chris, Stonewall Jackson, or Robert E. Lee might have thrown together in May of 1863. The bad news is that Hood doesn't have the same caliber of subordinates that Lee and Jackson did at Chancellorsville, say. Which is almost how this one sings, right? Leave a portion of your army, 10,000 men, some of the army's artillery behind, and move the bulk of the force behind the Federal lines, try and find the flank, turn the flank, and in the morning attack from both sides and destroy the Federal army in force in detail. That's a great idea. The problem is that circumstances almost seem to be against him really from the outset. The road that they think they're going to take doesn't turn out to be as effective as a road as it should be. So the Davis Ford Road's not as great as the Columbia Turnpike. The fighting that happens in Spring Hill, he kind of walks right into that, and that's because of really poorly put together reconnaissance and intelligence work by his chief of cavalry, Nathan Bedford Forrest. So Forrest drops the ball. And then Benjamin Cheatham changes the directive of the attack. Should they attack and move towards the Columbia Turnpike, or should they try and drive General George Wagner's division out of Spring Hill? So then Cheatham now drops the ball. And then Cheatham shows up to Hood, and Hood asks, does your flank extend across the road? And Cheatham answers in the affirmative, to quote John Bell Hood, and Cheatham leaves, and A.P. Stewart shows up. And now Stewart gets to grab a little share of the blame. So I know that there are people that have brought this to me a million times. You know, you hear it on tour, you hear it on responses to podcasts, you get it on videos. And Lee, we've been tagged in so many Facebook arguments, so many. There are certain Civil War pages that I've just blocked that way I don't get tagged in it anymore. But it's Hood was the Army commander, so it's completely his responsibility because he's in charge. Well, I guess my best defense to that is John Bell Hood doesn't handhold in the same way that Ulysses S. Grant didn't handhold, or that Robert E. Lee doesn't handhold. They don't need to check their subordinates because they've given orders to their subordinates, and they're soldiers, and soldiers follow their orders. I guess the best analogy, and I'm stealing this from Eric Jacobson, who you said you've got the best minds on Franklin and Spring Hill. We're missing Eric, and
We are.
so.
Yes.
But Eric used an analogy. He says, John Bell Hood is a career soldier, and Benjamin Cheatham is just a local Tennessean. And so the difference is that when you tell John Bell Hood, hey, here's your orders, he goes and he does it. And if you go to anybody who works for any small fence repair company or tree removal company in this area of Tennessee, and you say, hey, I've got a tree that fell on my property or a fence that needs to be put up, they say, yeah, I'll get around to it. And then they never do. So when Hood says block the road, Cheatham could have basically said, oh yeah, I'll get around to it. I'll do it eventually. It's gonna happen. It's just not gonna happen now. And then too, his inability to stay on the course of the directive throughout the day. For whatever reason, his fixation on driving the federal troops out of Spring Hill, that derails the entire thing. So I'm not a big fan of saying one person is to blame at Spring Hill. I think there's probably 10 or 12 dominoes that fall that fix it for the Confederate Army. But this is the piece of it that I to attach it to what we just said about John Schofield. For every single mistake that John Bell Hood or his subordinates and the Confederate Army make, John Schofield capitalizes on that mistake every single time.
I just, for the record, want to point out that we were 13 minutes into the podcast before someone brought up Stonewall Jackson, and it wasn't me. It was Joe. So I'll just say that. So, Lee, you're nodding along with a lot of what Joe says there. Take the ball for us. Schofield really capitalizes on all these mistakes.
Yeah, I mean, he, anytime, when Hood slips around his flank, he immediately throws out his own reconnaissance that finds out to detect Hood's movement, and he uses it. Forrest isn't there to stop Post's brigade from coming out on this reconnaissance. Forrest was distracted by Wilson. Wilson was drawing him away from what he really should have been doing. And so that was, again, Schofield's in charge of this and on the ball, and then deciding at Franklin, draws up there to cover his crossings of the river, getting the bridges repaired and getting everything, putting Tom Wood's troops on the north side of the river, and James Wilson's there, to be able to counter any flank move, which is what he expected, Hood to do. But he's ready for him. And when Forrest does cross the Harpeth River, he doesn't have a wide open field. He's facing Wilson, and then he has to get by Wilson. He's going to have to face Wood and Fort Granger. So, he's on the ball during his campaign. Heightened awareness, I guess, would be a term for it for these points. So.
And when I think about kind of the way you guys are both describing this as sort of command disconnects, and I'll sort of hold that up to Lee at Gettysburg, where anybody but Lee is to blame, and all Lee's subordinates get blamed for all this. But at Franklin, I mean at Spring Hill, Hood's to blame. It's not his subordinates, and it's
Well, he's not the
bad
marble
guy.
man.
Yeah,
Well,
He's not
that's
Lee the soldier.
yeah, that's one of the things that really gets me is that so many times you see anything with the Army of Tennessee. It can be Hood, it can be Braxton Bragg, similar type of thing. Lee does it. Well, it's Ewell's fault for not, following through and taking Culp's Hill. It's never, Lee. But with Hood, it can't be it can't be Frank Cheatham. It has to be John Bell Hood. Same type of thing. He sends the orders and Cheatham doesn't take care of the job. But yet it's Hood's fault. But Lee does the same thing kind of at Gettysburg with Ewell, and it's somehow Ewell's fault. So it's really kind of a double standard.
I mean, Chris and Lee, I think you both see the value in this point is that some of that just comes back to early memory of the campaign and the kind of cult-like following that a guy like Benjamin Cheatham has, who's got the loyal Tennesseans who will always follow him. The actual cult-like following of a guy like Nathan Bedford Forrest. And then today, when we think about the campaign, Patrick Cleburne has this amazingly devoted and very fiercely loyal following where he could have done no wrong. And so it's John Bell Hood's fault that he dies at Franklin because Hood ordered him to go
killed it
and die. He may as well have pulled out the gun and shot him himself.
That's
Hood
the way
killed
it's
Pat
always
Cleburne.
framed over and over again. Hood killed his army. Hood killed Cleburne. Hood,
But nobody ever says that about Lee at Cold Harbor or not Lee at Cold Harbor, Lee at Gaines Mill. Nobody says that about Lee at Gettysburg. They don't say Lee kills his army or tried to kill his army or really had it out for Chancellorsville has not come down to, well, Lee had it out for Stonewall Jackson, so he sent him out on a flight march that night to try and kill him. Like that doesn't happen to anyone else. Bragg and John Bell Hood.
Yeah, poor Hood does, I think, get a poor rap in his historical memory. I think part of that too ties into, and we'll get to this in a second, sort of the tragedy of Franklin, and so there has to be sort of this, tragic leader that leads the army to its doom, and et cetera, et cetera. And Hood gets set up as a straw man in a lot of that too. So let me ask you guys touched on something, which gets to my next point. Forrest botches his job.
Yes.
And so I'm getting some nods. So Lee, tell me, how does Forrest screw up here?
Well, the main thing is that Forrest kind of does what Forrest does. Forrest likes fighting. And a lot of times in this case, it's not what John Bell Hood needed him to do. It's not what the Army of Tennessee needed him to do. They needed him to be the proverbial eyes and ears of the army to do that traditional cavalry role. And that's just not really Nathan Bedford Forrest. He sees the enemy, he goes after him like a rabid bulldog, which, okay, that makes result for his big fan base and everything. And all that, he's, this, ornery cuss that'll punch your lights out, here in the bar brawl. And you needed
Some
the
of which never
finesse.
happened.
Yeah. You need the finesse. You need someone who's cool and collected and will draw back and report what he sees, not go after it. And then you find out after the fact, kind of like what we were talking about with the move on Spring Hill. He gets fixated on going after James Wilson and not bothering to really catch some things he should have been blocking, like, again, post reconnaissance, and also even detecting Wagner's whole advance up the Columbia Turnpike.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I feel like if Forrest was doing his job a little bit better, Hood would have known that the roads he'd chosen were longer than he expected and in worse condition than he expected. And that's just sort of intelligence that cavalry could do for you, right?
Right.
Mm-hmm. And two, I don't, now I'm going to sound like I'm being an apologist for Forrest, which disclaimer, I'm not.
This is getting good.
But definitely not. But two, think about how overused his cavalry command is by this phase of the war, especially even just this month of 1864. He's just come off of a Tennessee campaign of his own. crosses back over the Tennessee River, and then on, what is it, November the 14th, he's assigned to take on the Cavalry Corps for the Army of Tennessee. Now, if we're going to armchair general, Chris, I thought about this one just now. If you have to pick between Nathan Bedford Forrest or Joe Wheeler, who are you taking? I'm taking Wheeler.
In this case, for sure.
Absolutely.
He's the West Point guy. He's the, he knows reconnaissance. He knows this
Yeah.
type of stuff.
And so when Forrest shows up in Spring Hill, to kind of carry on to what you said, so he's fought against Wilson all morning long, Hertz's Crossroads, then up to Mount Carmel, but then he turns and he hits Wagner's division. And I always like to note, wrote my master's thesis on George Wagner's division in the Tennessee campaign. I don't get to talk about it very often. So whenever I get the chance, I got to roll it out. Nathan Bedford Forrest runs up against a 5,600-man division, but he hits primarily John Lane's brigade. John Lane had been in command for about 6 hours on November the 29th, and John Lane handles Nathan Bedford Forrest like a red-headed stepchild. I mean, just beats the pants off of him and sends Forrest retreating back down to the Caldwell house, Marion and St. Clair Caldwell, down in Spring Hill, south side of the town. And he just sits there, and he never even bothers to go and find Hood and the rest of the army. So then when Hood does show up, maybe Forrest goes and tells Cheatham or Claiborne or someone that there's federal troops in the area. Tyree Bell's cavalry brigade accompanies Claiborne's division into their attack. So it's possible that Forrest tells Claiborne, hey, watch out, there's some federal troops over there. And it's just never written down and never recorded because Claiborne's dead the next day and doesn't get to write a report. But I mean, talk about an intelligence failure on Forrest's part. So what is it that makes them fall apart? Is it that they're exhausted? Is it that they've been fighting all morning, so they're just worn out from the day? Or is it even more complicated in that they've been exhausted for the last month of campaigning? I don't know, but he's very much out of the ordinary and operating almost against his own army.
That is a provocative statement.
What am I doing? I'm here to cause trouble and stir the pot, Chris.
So, Lee, one of the long-standing arguments that Joe and I have been having for years now is the role of James Wilson. And I know James Wilson from the Wilderness, where he underperforms and he screws up and he's a terrible cavalry commander. Joe knows him from being out there in this campaign where he does a super effective job. And so we keep going back and forth like, will the real James Wilson please stand up? What's your assessment of James Wilson?
Okay, I think Wilson kind of comes into it kind of rough. He does not do all that great initially, but he learns and he learns quickly and he learns who his enemy. And so initially Forrest kind of had him on the go, but then he adapts, he keeps adapting, and finally by November 30th, he really owns Nathan Forrest.
Ooh, he owns him. Ooh. Now, in the split screen here, Joe's holding up his copy of Under the Old Flag, which is James Wilson's memoir. So, Joe, I'm to commemorate the 160th anniversary of the Battle of Franklin. I'm going to give this to you. You have won me over on James Wilson, in part due to the strong endorsement here that Lee has just offered as well.
So it took Lee White to finally win.
Well, it's just the magic of coming west. Some guys who really do badly east come west, and it's magical.
Yeah. I think it's the quality drop off, to be fair.
But I will also admit though that Wilson gets put in a role that he's not ready for when he gets here. So this is his learning curve that allows him to do better once he finally gets out there too. So he sort of learned his lessons out here that he can apply when he gets out there.
One thing that I mean, just to throw on lots of praise here for James Wilson, think about the cavalry corps that he inherits when he takes over command of the military district of Mississippi's cavalry. He gets Judson Kilpatrick, who he's already going to lose because he's going with Sherman to the March to the Sea. He gets the cavalry corps that's in Nashville. There's like 7,000 men there, but 3,000 of them just lost their horses because those are being sent south with Judson Kilpatrick to go to Savannah. So Wilson shows up gets effectively Horace Capron's brigade, John Croxton's brigade. He's got Hatch. He's got a handful of kind of notable cavalry names that he has to stitch together and make into a functional fighting force. I think by the time he gets to Nashville, that's a whole different cavalry corps. He's got what, almost 13 or 14,000 men by the time he's there.
And
Uh,
13.
yeah. So I I can't help but find ways to throw heaps of praise at him. I'm sorry.
Well, it's important to remember that he gets his job as a cavalry person because he really has an administrative post to start with, and
Mhm.
he's very good at that part of it. So it doesn't surprise me when he comes out west and he's able to leverage those administrative skills to kind of get the cavalry into the shape he needs it in, and then he's able to actually execute it. So. All right, very good. So this ties into my next question because it's also about Forrest. We've talked about his inadequacies. So after Spring Hill, Hood moves up to Franklin. He sees the Federal Army hunkered down by the river, and Forrest is like, "Let's just play this out a second, and we can outflank these guys and not have to do a frontal assault." And Hood doesn't listen to him. And Hood maybe should have listened to him. That's my provocative statement. What do you guys think? Did Hood make the right call, or should he have listened to his cavalry commander? Oh, I'm getting you both thinking about this one.
Yeah.
Oh, and Lee is, for those who can't see, Lee is stroking his beard, which always makes everybody look smarter. So I got to try that as well. Um, so Lee, what do you think? Should Hood have listened to Forrest? Was Forrest onto something?
I don't really think so. Uh, a lot of other factors. Number one, time. Again, time is of the essence in all of this, and they've got to have the opportunity as well. There's other factors contributing, of course, that will play out a little bit later on, and it's just kind of one of those things. Is that again, I'm not seeing Forrest really having a good idea of the whole situation. Again, he's looking at it from his point of view without really thinking the position can be flanked, and but that's not really going to be possible.
So he's seeing a vision that really isn't there. Is that what you're saying?
I believe so.
Okay. All right. Joe, what do you think?
I largely agree with everything Lee said and add in too that John Bell Hood understood when he arrived in Franklin that Schofield wasn't staying. So there's always the idea, oh, well, Forrest would have just taken an infantry division and his cavalry and crossed over somewhere east of Franklin over the Harpeth River. Well, we know what happens when Forrest does try to cross over the Harpeth River during the general engagement of the rest of the fight. Half of his men don't get across the river. The ones that do get shot up by about equal numbers of cavalry under Croxton, and they get turned back. And once he clears through that, he would still have to contend with Thomas John Wood's division, which is almost 5 or 6 thousand men. So he's got a lot of obstacles in his way, and that's just to get behind Schofield. That's not to say that he can somehow fight him off and try and fight in Schofield's rear once he gets there. That is a whole other problem altogether. But here's the thing: this is the kill-all argument. Everyone that says that John Bell Hood is completely responsible for what happens at Spring Hill assumes that he is in complete command of the army, and it is his job to say what the army should and shouldn't do. So then when Hood shows up at Franklin and he says, okay, we're going to attack, those same people say, well, he should have listened to his subordinates and done what his subordinates said. All right, so if you're John Bell Hood, again, we're armchair generaling, and I've got both of my armchair. It's ready. I'm good. I've got another armchair right behind me just in case. I'm ready to armchair general this. If Nathan Bedford Forrest, who had failed me so awfully the day before, showed up and said, hey, I have a better idea, I wouldn't listen to him because he just screwed up the previous day. What's he going to do now to screw things up even more?
Like there's a huge credibility issue there for Forrest.
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
Well, and then as reality proves about flank them crossing the Harpeth. Well, what happens? when he tries to you just physically cross, thinking you could get infantry across that river. It's just not possible. I mean, that's one of the things kind of gets left out of this is why Schofield's still in Franklin. The Harpeth has just washed out the bridges. The waters are still high. When Forrest crosses over, he loses men and horses. Men swept off their horses that flounder in the water crossing over. So there was no way infantry could cross that. There's no way artillery could cross that. And cavalry has a struggle to get across it.
Think about the Harpeth River too. The other problem is not that it's deep, it's not that it's wide. The banks are just stupid steep. I mean, it's straight down, straight back up the other side. Okay, maybe you get the horses across. That's a slog for an infantryman. And Lee, I know you and I have put in our times trekking around, carrying heavy equipment, wearing awful shoes and wool uniforms, climbing up really awful, terrible hills. The Confederate Army marched 14 miles that day, and they showed up in Franklin. And if somebody would have come to them and said, okay, now we're going to march another 5 miles, we're going to find a spot to cross on the Harpeth River, and we're going to scale the banks to get up and down, and then try and attack Schofield in the rear, I don't know how you get an effective fighting force behind Schofield.
And there's the matter of the setting sun too. I mean, it's late in the day, right?
When Hood decides to attack, it's 4 o'clock. Sun sets at 4:37 p.m. So he's got 37 minutes of sunlight left once the attack starts. I mean, Hood can see at 1 o'clock when he gets there, 3 layers of federal defenses, all these things. And by 1:30, he could also make out the fact that Schofield's pulling guns and wagons to the north side of the Harpeth with no intention to stay in Franklin. And you want the proof for this. Schofield even told Thomas, I will not hold here for 24 hours. I mean, what else could you possibly want from the man? Hood makes the only decision left, which is to attack.
And I mean, again, we go back to that about, looking at the campaign as a battle in a way. Lee of Gettysburg, he attacks, one flank, it's repulsed, things don't go the way, so he hits some, moves forward and hits in the center. Well, what had Hood tried to do at Columbia? What had Hood tried to do at Spring Hill?
Yep.
And of course, that challenges that other notion about Hood. All he ever did was order frontal assaults. He tried to flank him twice. And then, as Franklin, with the sun setting, condition of the Harpeth River, only thing he has open to him is attack. And because we'd be sitting here today, flip the situation. If he didn't attack, Hood would be damned for letting Schofield get away at Franklin.
Yep. Selfishly, I wouldn't have a job, right? But like that's the thing I always go back to is like, okay, 160 years later, you sit back and you go, well, that Hood, what a missed opportunity at Franklin.
Yeah. Which his whole career seems to be defined by as a result. Right? Yeah. So, and you guys raise a great point, and I'll just underscore this, particularly since Lee's wearing his American Battlefield Trust hat. This is why battlefield preservation is so important. This is why walking the ground is so important, because if you take a walk down to the Harpeth River and you see those crazy steep banks, you'll see for yourself, this is not an easy river to get across, and that poses tremendous logistical issues. And even if you're going to cut your own road to get down and up, that takes time that Hood doesn't have at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So, I mean, it's just, walk the ground, understand the story so much better. So.
Yeah.
All right. So speaking of walking the ground, as Schofield hunkers down, trying to fix the bridge so he can get his army across, he sends out George Wagner's division to kind of hold the frontal position, and they get overrun. That seemed like a stupid thing, right, Joe? It's a dumb thing, right?
Oh God! You did it. How long's this episode supposed to be?
But there again, this was a great thing because Joe and I had the chance to walk this ground just a couple of weeks ago, and boy, it's clear as day as to why they're out there. If you're out there on the ground,
yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so the only way that I can explain this isn't going to have a visual side, is it? Well, we're done. All right, there's a hill on my right. That's Carter Hill. There's a hill on my left. That's Winstead Hill. Both of these hills drop down and then level out. By Winstead Hill on my left, to the south of Franklin, is about a 100-foot high hill. It's called Privet Knob, or my favorite name for it, 100-foot high hill, because they're not a very creative people. It's Privet Knob. It's where the Merrill house would have sat, stone fencing around it, uncultivated cornfield, cotton field just south of it, overlooking the kind of low ground in front of Winstead Hill. Well, once you get past Privet Knob, the ground kind of starts to level out again and then drops and then levels out towards what today is Fairground Avenue, where there is a Shell gas station across the street, West Coast Taco Shop, where we went and had a delicious lunch, Chris. Right there, the ground picks back up. Wedge-shaped plane that, if you look at a good topographical map of Franklin, almost looks like a chevron spread out on the south side of town, kind of hugging Franklin towards the Harpeth River. And then the ground drops off again. And it starts to very gradually rise. And what's tricky about it is if you're standing looking in a certain direction on the ground there, you'd swear that you're not on a hill. You'd swear that the ground is level. But if you turn to your left or you turn to your right, you can easily see that the hill's dropping off. That's Carter Hill. So already we've seen that there's really two undulations in between Carter Hill and Winstead Hill. Well, when the federal line digs in on the south side of Carter Hill, south of the Carter property, they can't see beyond the wedge-shaped plane a half-mile south. So then Wagner's division, which had been the rear guard of the army, protecting it all the way from Spring Hill to Franklin, now transitions into a role as the advance guard. There's the controversy. There's the problem. Why would you have your most exhausted troops in the entire army in the most dangerous position? Because it's not even a matter of their distance. It's not even a matter of where they're at on the battlefield. It's just that being the advance guard is a dangerous spot. And that's just an old military axiom. So why have the most exhausted troops there? There's the only problem. But Wagner's men are there for one reason and one reason alone. They can see. They can see to Privet Knob and they can see Winstead Hill. If you can see from Winstead Hill, you can also see where Columbia Pike kind of funnels down into town. So you could see if the Confederate Army is, in fact, in pursuit of you, which Wagner knows they are because he'd been fighting them all morning long. But he gets to Winstead Hill early in the morning. By 11:30, pulls back from Winstead to Privet Knob, and by 2 o'clock is positioned on this wedge-shaped plain with orders to hold the heights he now occupies until severely pressed, until dark. And if he's pressed, he's to fall back to the main line of work. So Wagner takes his position. Around 2:30, met with Jacob Cox at the Carter House. Cox commands the 3rd Division of the 23rd Corps, now kind of in command of all federal troops on the field. And this becomes a point of contention later because Cox would say, I commanded all the federal troops on the field, just not the men on the advanced line. Which is an interesting delineation because what he's doing is putting some distance between what happens next. And Cox asks Wagner, what are your orders? And Wagner says, my orders are to hold the heights I occupy until dark unless severely pressed and place Optics Brigade in support. That's it. Cox leaves, goes out to the west side of the line. 3 o'clock rolls along. There's some heavy skirmishing out front. Wagner visits with Lane and Conrad, who command his brigades. John Lane supposedly asks if they should fall back. Wagner says, no, tell your sergeants to fix bayonets and hold this position. It's not a standalone act of bravado, crazy, last stand action he's trying to fight. If there is an attack coming, he wants to know where it's coming from. Will it be on the left flank? Will it be on the right flank? What no one could have assumed is that Hood would throw the entire force into a fight this late in the day, because all throughout the day, you read some of the contemporary accounts, you read from David Stanley, you read John Schofield, you read Jacob Cox, you read Wagner, you read soldiers, individual soldiers, 64th Ohio, 57th Indiana, both of those frontline regiments out on the main line, tons of accounts to pull from. John Schellenberger, Asbury Curwood, Joel Finney, Milton Barnes. All these men are saying the same thing. We could never have expected them to fight. And then the guys on the main line, even less expectant of a fight. So if they're there for any reason, it's because they can see and they can feel what's coming. The problem is that when the attack does get underway, they're there for just a moment too long. And we could we could say, I can say this now, and this is a very mature thing for me to say, considering I worked for 2 years to try and exonerate him and realized I couldn't do it. Wagner just makes a mistake. I mean, it really is just that simple. It's a judgment call, and he gets it wrong. But even Jacob Cox, in his criticism of Wagner in 1897, rebounds immediately and says, we must remember that he regained his balance. Wagner says, never mind that, stand there and fight them. The second division can whip all hell. And then 5 minutes later, orders Lane and Conrad to fall back. The problem is it's just too late. They're there for maybe a minute too long. And then all of a sudden, there's no choice now but to stand there and fight, which is exactly what Joseph Conrad says in his report. I thus determined to stand and fight. So they did.
So Lee, by the time they do pull out, they're basically acting as human shields to protect the advancing Confederates, aren't they?
And yes, unintentionally, but yes, at least Brown and Claiborne.
A little part of French.
Yeah.
Sears Brigade.
Yeah, Sears Brigade.
Into that.
Yeah. But it's not, the problem is too, when this is where they're going to really throw off Hood's plan, they disrupt Hood's attack from being a full frontal assault. They disrupted that you're going to have Stuart's guys hitting the works and most likely already repulsed by the time Brown and Claiborne hit the line. And then that just disrupts Hood's whole plan. Everything falls apart because of that.
They're an interesting little stumbling block out front.
This sounds like Dan Sickles at Gettysburg. I went out there and I blunted the assaults.
So, I mean, if Wagner wanted to say that, he could have. I mean,
so Lee, how do you assess Wagner's performance?
Just like Joey. I mean, he's gotten a raw deal throughout the historical memory, and he was a good veteran officer at this point. I mean, veteran fighter in the Army of the Cumberland, and he just has a bad day. Makes the wrong call. And I mean, it's just kind of how it plays out. Sometimes you make that wrong call in a day and there's no severe consequences. Well, this one was a little more severe.
Yeah. And I think the thing that I was always fascinated, I'm sorry, now I'm gushing, right? The thing that's always fascinated me about him is, like, in 24 hours, he has the greatest day of his military career. The sun sets, comes up the next day, and he has the single worst day of his entire life, entire military career. And then his life just falls apart. And he dies early. So even by the time all the criticisms start to be leveled at him, he's dead. He can't defend himself. But let's kill a myth real quick. He's not drunk, he's not stupid, and he's not incompetent. And he didn't argue with Emerson Opdyke, and he put him where he's supposed to be anyways. There, done.
And I would also just say, go walk the ground. If you have doubts, go walk the ground, and you can see why he's got to be out there in the first place. It is a smart spot to be because you're the eyes and ears of the Army when you're out there. So.
I'm here for conversion. That's what I'm doing.
All right, my next comment here, and Lee, I'll toss this at you to start with. Schofield should have been on the battlefield playing a more direct role instead of kind of being in the back and conducting things.
Do not agree at all.
All right, very good.
Because he placed Jacob Cox in charge of defense, a good decision, tactically, strategic wise. He's on the north side of the river, overseeing the important work, which is getting those bridges built so he can follow his directive to get to Thomas. And I mean, he's got to be there. Can react to that. It also places him in effect in the area that if Hood was to try to flank the position, he's going to be on that side of the river to oversee the defense in that area. If that's what happens. So, again, I think it's part of some of the raw deal that does get placed on Schofield. But no, I think he's where he needs to be.
Joe?
Anybody ever criticize Robert E. Lee for staying at his headquarters through the second day of Gettysburg? I mean, that's where an Army commander is supposed to be. People criticize Hood. He should have led in with the assault. Again, not where an Army commander is supposed to be. Look at the war as a great lesson for what happens when an Army commander gets too close to the front. Albert Sidney Johnston. We don't need to use just Army commanders, but hell, Nathaniel Lyon's a good choice too.
Stonewall Jackson.
Commanders, Jackson, right?
There, I
Lieutenant
got him worked
Polk,
in there.
John Sedgwick, all men who shouldn't have been so close to the front as they were, and they end up being caught in the firefight. The other thing, adding on to what Lee said, Jacob Cox is the better tactical commander. So why not let the guy who has the qualified duds lead the defense of the town and lead the defense of the army? And Cox is a good soldier. He's not trained, is not a military man. He's figured this out over the last really 2 years, how to fight and lead men in combat. And he's a very capable soldier. And it's not Schofield's job to be at the front. There.
And I would add to that too, that, if his primary concern is to save the army, well, the big point of crisis is to get him across the river.
Yeah.
And so he's got to be able to oversee that portion of events and make sure that that successfully happens, or else everything else is kind of a bust. So,
Lee, do you think he has a moment of self-reflection? Like he looks at himself and goes, "There's just no way I can actually do this on my own. I'm not capable of
I think
this."
so. I mean, he goes because he places himself not to oversee things, but of course, what's Schofield's background? What is his military background?
Mm-hmm.
And he's using that. He's overseeing the construction of those bridges to get his army out of there, which that's his strong suit.
Yep.
While he knows Cox can handle the job. I mean, it's kind of on some other ways up many other battlefields where you see the same type of behavior. You put your guy in charge of this, and then you go take care of what you need to do.
Mm-hmm.
It's just like the use of Thomas by Rosecrans at
Yep.
points.
Yep.
He trusts Thomas to hold off the rear, hold the rear guard while at Chickamauga, while the army falls back to recover. So again, a lot of times that's part of it. You've got to have a good team that you can depend on, your senior subordinates, and know how to use them, and Schofield does. So
He's
That's a
also got other brilliant subordinates too.
Yes.
David Stanley,
yes,
4th Corps commander, who, although he's wounded in the fight, another example of why general officers shouldn't be on the front line. David Stanley gets shot in the neck. But then he's also got Thomas Ruger as a division commander who has earned his stripes all across the Eastern Theater and Western Theater. So why not lean on them? Nathan Kimball, Thomas John Wood, all really capable division commanders, corps commanders. Why not lean on that?
So here's my next question, or next point. There was no point during the battle that the Confederates could have actually pulled out a victory. Lee, what do you think?
well, I mean, there's moments where they could have victory if you had lesser officers opposing them on the other side, because you do have the breakthrough in the center. And then, the establishment of the retrenchment, the other lines, that having Opdyke in the rear at that point as a reserve force, but also, what happened, how some of these guys react, good officers again, with like Riley's, Colonel Riley, his brigade, they stopped Hood, the breach there. And same thing with the 44th Missouri boys and the 183rd Ohio men and all, green troops that this shouldn't be happening. These are the guys that should be running at first sight, but they're staying put and they're holding the ground. And so the Confederates, do have that initial breakthrough, and what shouldn't happen happens. The green troops stay and fight. You're back, some of your Southern Unionists with Riley, they stay and fight. And so it's just one of those things. I kind of think it's a razor's edge thing at that point, that it could go one way or it could go the other, and the Confederates do have that opportunity, and just things work against them at that point. And so, Joey,
In a rare instance, Lee, I'm going to disagree with you.
okay,
there's two opportunities where Hood almost has it. The breakthrough, easy, right?
Yeah.
Punch through with Claiborne and Brown. I mean, then it's really just a fight man on man. But then later in the evening, when Johnson's division goes forward, he's supposed to hit the center. He's supposed to hit where Claiborne and Brown hit. And honest to goodness, when you think about the fact that the 44th Missouri on the secondary line almost broke under the weight of Claiborne and Brown's division hitting it, they're bolstered by the fact that a lot of the mainline regiments, 50th Ohio, 72nd Illinois, 24th Missouri, 107th Illinois, and then the 111th Ohio hold on with them on the secondary line. But you throw another Confederate infantry division, 4 brigades strong, at the center. I mean, the whole point of this is what ifs and hypotheticals and armchairing it. I mean, if Johnson's division doesn't meander to the west and end up striking against the left half of Ruger's division and off towards, Moore's brigade, I think you're looking at something completely different, a whole other turnout and result. Now, that again, it's a big what if, but Johnson drifts, and we know this, that he gets faulty directions, the division's out of line. So when they do finally strike the works, they hit near Moore and he turns them back. 250 some odd casualties in like 25 minutes of fighting. But I mean, it's worth a punt at 7 o'clock to throw them forward. And, if it hits the right spot, it may very well could have worked.
And at that point, it's dark. He sort of drifts off course because it's dark. He doesn't know
Yeah.
where he's going, all that kind of stuff too. I would also add, because I like old Allegheny, that like he's a guy who's got something to prove because he's been banished to the west by Robert E. Lee after the breakthrough at Spotsylvania, which was Lee's fault, not Johnson's, but they break through Johnson's guys. So he gets sent to the west. He's got something to prove. He's got a really good record as a fighting division commander here in the east. So I think they have capable leadership if they just hit the right spot with some guy who's got something to prove. That's a pretty interesting dynamic to me.
Well, and also fresh brigades too, guys who were not engaged at Spring Hill the evening before and not been involved in any of the other fighting on this, part of the field. So I think that's another factor that's going to play in for them.
And besides, he has his club, which he could use to, beat down the Federal Army single-handedly. All right. So we're getting close to time here. My last provocative statement. After Franklin, Hood should not have gone on to Nashville.
I agree.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I can defend him all the way through from Atlanta to Franklin. But it's when he goes north of the Harpeth River that you really have to figure out what he could do. Now, I guess my condition for that is the same thing I led off with our discussion is what else is he supposed to do?
That's what I would go back to. Like, what
He
else?
can go to Murfreesboro, but what's he going to do in Murfreesboro? That's not the objective. The objective had always been Nashville. So he goes to Murfreesboro. What? He seizes some supplies, maybe disrupts a couple of the blockhouses, messes with the railroad a little bit. He can't go to Chattanooga. Too heavily fortified, too many men being processed in and out, so that's out. So the option is Nashville or turn around and go home. But if he turns around and he goes home, the army dissolves.
Well, I mean, what was the goal, from the get-go? Nashville. So
he's got to do it.
So, I mean, if he, at that point, if he does not go on, like Joey says, the army's going to dissolve. And he's going to lose, the Tennesseans are, gone, but you're going to lose, your Alabama, even some of your Alabamians and everything else. And it's just, again, it's still continuing that Hail Mary pass. It's like, if got to throw it all in it to win it.
So here's something I want to ask you guys too. the aftermath of this, because Hood has the field, it's often described as a Confederate victory, but it's a Pyrrhic victory because of his losses in troops and in command experience. I just want to say that's balderdash. That's my perspective. Like, it's just a flat out loss, even though he's holding the field. That's how do you guys agree or disagree?
I mean, yeah, I mean, I said that in my book, tactically it is, by that old scale thing, it is a victory. But casualties are too high. Officer leadership is in trouble.
Mhm.
And I think that's something kind of gets left out of this, is your company grade and regimental officers that are lost.
Mhm.
It's just, at this point, broke.
Yeah, I'd add too that you know, the you can't classify it as a victory because what was Hood's objective at Franklin was to try and destroy Schofield or stop him from getting to Nashville or get to Nashville himself. And he doesn't do that. In fact, John Schofield secures his objective, which is to get his army safely to Nashville. So, if anything, not only is it a tactical victory for John Schofield and having dealt a stunning blow to the Confederate army, it's also a strategic victory in the long run because he secures his strategic objective, which is to get to Nashville and fortify the city with Thomas. So it's a Confederate loss on two accounts. Now, what's amazing is 18 months after the battle, when they're dedicating the cemetery and we start having decoration days, there's a great speech by a Tennessee congressman named Edward Galladay. He gets up and he says, this was a feat of arms where Southerners proved themselves against the mighty foe and secured a victory on valor-crowned battlefields. And it's like, secured a victory? And you're standing in a graveyard full of 1,481 men who got killed here. They didn't secure a victory, they died. The army was destroyed. And then they go to Nashville, and whatever's left of it is just I had a
Popped up.
discussion the other day in a historic commission meeting. They were trying to say is that Franklin's the last great battle of the Civil War. I said, well, I wouldn't go that far. Nashville's pretty great. It's a great battle of the war. I mean, heck, Pyle thought it was. That's why he painted it. But so what is Franklin? Well, they killed the body and they put it in the casket, and then in Nashville they put the lid on it.
Good analogy.
Yeah. So to wrap up, I want to just give each of you the chance to talk about briefly just what is it about the Battle of Franklin that has captivated you? Because both of you have spent your whole lives fascinated by this battle. And Lee, the thing I love most about your book, Let Us Die Like Men, is like it was basically like this kind of a love letter to a battle that had fascinated you since you were a kid. Tell me a little bit about, why does this battle still resonate strongly with you?
I mean, it's the high, well, I'm also drawn now more by the misunderstandings of the battle and the things that have been kind of left out of the narrative over the years. When I was a kid, I mean, it was high drama, I get so tired, every July 3rd, you always hear the William Faulkner, thing about every Southern boy, blah, blah, blah. Well, for me, it was kind of November 30th, 1864, and not July 3rd. And I mean, it's just got a lot of, thing that always draws me into this is these stories of the soldiers. And you just have such high drama with that at Franklin. You know, on both sides, it's just a lot of tales that just are astounding. And if somebody ever just tried to make a movie about it, nobody knew the history, they would, this couldn't possibly be true.
Mhm. Yeah, I largely second everything that Lee said, and I'll tell you, as someone, Lee, you grew up coming here and seeing the sights and everything. In a lot of ways, you and I have had a shared sort of vein in that we both grew up seeing the Franklin battlefield, and we've both been around long enough to see it change from the first time that you saw it and the first time that I saw it, and we're here and it's still changing. The battlefield is being reclaimed actively. You know, at the end of the month, they're going to close a contract for another building to be purchased and that ground to be reclaimed. It's going to be an amazing moment. I think the thing about Franklin that has drawn me in, much like Lee said, is there's the human drama of it. Um, you couldn't ask for a better story. I've always liked the fact that one of the first slogans for the Battle of Franklin Trust was the greatest story of the Civil War. And then everybody says, well, what about Gettysburg? What about Appomattox? What about this? What about that? What about William McLean and his parlors? All this stuff. Fine. But tell me about another place where you can find a 67-year-old father who, on the morning after the battle, walks out onto a battlefield and finds his son mortally wounded, carries him back into the house, and as his oldest surviving son, Moscow, recalled, spent the next 36 hours next to his dying brother's side, watching him die in the house that he's born in, surrounded by his family, and then that 67-year-old father gets to do something that 2,500 other fathers from the Battle of Franklin don't get to do and bury his son. I mean, come on. That's one of the most, it's a gut-wrenching story, but it's one of the most impactful stories of our war because it's a reminder that this isn't just about soldiers. There are people at home who are waiting for someone to come back and they never do. They expect that son that they sent off to war in 61 or even as late as, November and September of 1864 for those guys in the 183rd Ohio and the 44th Missouri, there's a mother that's waiting on her, what I think he's a 15-year-old son in the 44th Missouri, lied about his age, ran off, joined the army. She's expecting him to come home. He survived the battle. He dies of smallpox when he gets to Nashville. And there's a mother that's expecting at some point he'll come back, and he never does. There's those stories, and then I always think about the pictures that come from the reunions. I'm a big reunions guy. I love seeing these men come back to the battlefields where they fought as, geezers carrying their canes and their rifles. And you look at the faces of those men in the 44th Missouri, you look at the men in the 175th Ohio or the 100 and 104th Ohio or any of the artillery batteries that were there, and they show back up in Franklin, and the Confederates are there with them. And you can see that this battle is something that remained with them. And I think it's because of the intimacy of the fighting. So all of that, I think, ties into why I love it. And then too, that it's been saved. And that it's this kind of incredible story about reclamation. We talked about walking the ground. Well, the American Battlefield Trust, the Battle of Franklin Trust, saved the Franklin battlefield, Franklin's charge, the city of Franklin, state of Tennessee, and your United States taxpayer dollars have gone towards saving a piece of ground that you can walk on. And it's not just, and now I'm preaching, it's not just a place where you can walk, it's also a place where you can understand that the fate of the nation was quite literally saved and delivered to us on a platter supported by 752,000 men that died in the American Civil War. And there at Franklin, there's 2,500 that did. And there's an incredible story of sacrifice, but then that these places are now a space for us to come and reflect on what was at stake for 4 years was that the very fate of the nation, the experiment in American liberty, of democracy, of the republic, the question of who we would be as our national identity. Are we a place where you can live free, or are we a place that's divided bitterly about free states and slave states and the politics of slavery? All of that is decided at places like Antietam and Gettysburg and Vicksburg and Fredericksburg and Franklin.
And Chickamauga and Chattanooga too, which I'll add there, right? Just for Lee's sake, for his job security.
I threw in Fredericksburg for you and took out Chickamauga, Chattanooga.
Thanks, Joe.
Hey, he's running this thing. We're just talking heads.
Yeah. So, and I just want to kind of put in that pitch too, for people to go out and visit Franklin. Lee, your book really piqued my interest and made me fascinated by this battle. And I want to thank you for that. And then Joe, you and I have spent many fantastic days on the field together, and just sort of listening to you with your feet on the ground, talking about that story has just been incredibly powerful for me and a wonderful, wonderful impact on me. So, folks, go see Franklin and that reclamation that Joe has talked about, because it's a marvelous place, well worth seeing if you haven't had the chance to see it. Guys, I've enjoyed the chance to just toss some provocative statements out at you and have you guys say smart things, and I get to listen to it. I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
So, On behalf of Lee and Joe, I'm Chris Mackowski. Thanks for being with us on the Emerging Civil War podcast. We'll see you online and on the battlefield.